welcome the filmmakers behind Women Talking, starting with screenwriter and director Sarah Polley, cinematographer Luc Montpellier, costume designer Quita Alfred, production designer Peter Cosco, and editor Chris Donaldson. So, Sarah, in terms of getting everyone on the same page and making the same movie, what were your kind of guiding principles going into this in terms of the visual style and what you wanted the filmmaking language to be?
For me, this is a really momentous story and a really epic story, and I didn't want to shy away from that, of the gravity and momentousness of it. I think the natural pull, I think, for a lot of people when they were thinking about this being adapted was, you know, this very small chamber piece in the hayloft. And for me, I knew we needed to breathe. I knew we needed to be able to get outside. I knew we needed to have a kind of expansiveness to it. So we talked a lot about the camera being very intentional and not shying away from underlining things with both camera movement and the framing, and to just kind of really move towards just the gravity kind of in every moment, and not shy away from that, and not be modest about what this story was about and the impact.
Well, Luc, you've worked with Sarah several times before, so how early do you come into the process, and what kinds of discussions do you have early on in pre-production?
Well, I have the fortune of getting involved fairly early in Sarah's process. She sends me a script fairly early with a few other people that she's worked with. So I basically are able to start thinking visually and bouncing ideas, and, you know, Sarah will have a very intentional kind of point of view as far as language goes of what we want to do that kind of sets us off on a path. So that as, you know, and then sometimes Sarah's gone back and rewritten some things, and so in a way I get to start thinking about what we're going to make months beforehand. And sometimes you've written scripts that we're still financing, but it's still such a fortunate thing to be able to do, to have that kind of relationship. So, and then you know, you're in the shower and you're thinking, you have every minute of the day to start thinking about stuff, as opposed to when you start prep officially, which is rare to have.
Well, in terms of the photography, what kinds of references or influences did the two of you have? Were you looking at photographs, paintings, other movies? What kinds of things?
It's funny because we've never really watched things together when we're prepping a film. We've really been adverse to that in a way. We've always wanted to make sure we were creating our own language. With this film, we watched a ton of stuff, and it's not like there was anything specific. Like, I mean, I thought that a movie like 12 Angry Men would be more helpful than it was. I mean, I love that film so deeply, but ultimately what it is, you know, 12 people in a room making a discrete decision that doesn't directly impact their lives. And these women are sitting around talking about making and, you know, breaking and remaking their entire world. And so in a strange way, that wasn't as helpful as we thought. I mean, we just sort of returned to all the movies we loved and just rewatched them and talked about them, and didn't sort of directly think about borrowing from them, but just let that kind of sink into us in terms of the films that we love and that have bonded us over the years. So, I mean, we watched a lot of Sidney Lumet, you know, but not 12 Angry Men, but lots of Sidney Lumet. We watched, we revisited, like, it was such a broad range. We watched every movie we could think of where it's a bunch of characters in a room. So Glengarry Glen Ross was on that list. We watched a ton of I was watching a lot of Bergman, and sort of returning to that. Terrence Malick, P.T. Anderson. We just kind of went to everything we loved, and then tried not to borrow too directly, but just let it sort of sink into our subconscious.
Did you have anything you wanted to add to that?
Yeah.
Yes, and for me also, there was a lot of photography that we looked at as well, because I think, because when we started talking, Sarah handed me Larry Towell's books, because he had a lot of access to Mennonite photography, and his work is very powerful but very simple. And I remember, you know, there were color, black and white. There was all these different things that I just remember loving, just having an emotional reaction to, without thinking, hey, we're making another film, and as Sarah said. So having that kind of more abstract, but he taught us, for me, I really took that from Larry's work, which was try to create an image that has its own narrative without doing too much, just by where you put the camera, where the light's coming from, a very simplistic way. And then that with the rehearsals, we had this amazing rehearsal period with the actors where they were interpreting the text, and I was there to witness Sarah working with them over a week, where we went through every scene in our set that was being built by Peter at the time. There were still construction people there. That in combination, it's amazing how they influenced the tone for me and how I fed off them. With the color and the texture, we all had these broad ideas of what we wanted to do, but they kind of solidified everything for me during that.
Well, since you brought up color and texture, that leads me to a question about the costumes, which is, there's a number of questions I have about the costumes, but I'll start with color. What kinds of things were you thinking? Because I noticed watching this movie, different characters have distinct colors that are associated with them. What was your approach? It seems to me like this would be both exciting and kind of a challenge for a costume designer in that the costumes are so important because there aren't that many of them. It all takes place, in such a short period of time. So if you make a mistake, you're in trouble. It's going to screw the whole movie up. And then also, the clothes these women wear are sort of, for lack of a better word, plain and unadorned, but you still want to give them texture and character and have them say something about the people who are wearing them. So what was your approach coming into this?
Well, first of all, I'm very glad that you noticed that each character had a distinct look. I appreciate that. We started, but I was also lucky to get on board, just on the idea train, if not the prep train, very early. And so in discussions with Sarah and with Luc, first thing I had to wrap my head around was the desaturation of everything, because that obviously would make a difference to my work and of course to Peter's as well. So then, once I sent some things out to Luc, and he did a very casual test with his daughter. I sent some real Mennonite dresses out and some fabrics, I can't remember, Luc. And he sent me back the results of that test so I could wrap my head around turning everything down where we were 75%, and just I could see what the patterns would do and what colors would disappear and which wouldn't, and how patterns that I thought were quite beautiful and even became distracting and a little bit buzzy once they had been turned down. So once I wrapped my head around the concept of the desaturation, then I tried to think about, sometimes I call it mood, sometimes I call it personality. I divided the families. I divided the Friesens and the Lowens and the Jans families in particular, those three. And August and his world was a little bit less complicated, so I knew what I was doing with him, but then I assigned colors in my mind, and then I checked this with Sarah and asked what she thought about it with Luc. For example, I gave the Friesen women tighter patterns, purer colors, blues, purples, a little bit more electric. I use the word electric. I'm not even quite sure why. That came to me as I was looking at these colors. Busy, industrious, smaller patterns. With the Lowen family, I chose instinctively, I think, just in comparison to the others, warmer, more natural colors. I mean, all colors are natural, of course, but in this case, browns and greens and broader patterns. Murkier patterns and textures that somehow spoke to me about the trouble under the surface in that family. And that seemed to, the actors responded quite well to that too. And then with the Jans family, because of the rigid, like they are the most restrictive, the most traditional group in our story, essentially, and for them, besides the fact that in reality, matrons of Scarface Jans's generation and age and thought, really, are very traditional, very dark clothing, very small pattern. I remember Anna Lowen in Winkler, Manitoba, in soft-line fabrics. I was lucky enough to work with actual Mennonite merchants and women. I was choosing fabric, I was buying fabric, and she said, "Oh, my mother would never wear that." And I thought, "Oh, okay, thank you." And I went through with her and said, "What?" And she was a woman of about my age, and so Therefore, her mother had been still quite traditional. So I took her cues with things. I had so much wonderful help. But once we decided that division of personality and mood, then I spoke, of course, with each actor individually and asked what they thought, or if there's anything I could do for them to help them bring to life their character, because as you said, it was so limited, and the lives of these women are so limited, and the costuming is so limited. And I've said this before in other interviews, that like churches have divided over the idea of whether or not women were allowed to wear buttons on their dresses, whether that was too prideful. So having had the luxury of months and months of research and growing up in southern Manitoba, which is one of the biggest Mennonite communities in North America still, and where many of the communities then left to go to Central and South America, I had access to this wonderful chest of knowledge. I was given access to both modern secular Mennonite women, mostly, women and men, but then to their relatives, to their knowledge, to their family histories. And so I took little bits from all of that and tried to use it to inform my costumes. And then it was mostly the color. And then we tested those patterns to see how they worked in Peter's sets, because there was a lot going on in Peter's sets, even though with the desaturation, I brought a lot of that down too. And we tried to see whether we were going to lose characters in the sets or not, or whether what we were trying to do with the expression of the fabric would work once we got them on set, whether once we got all the women in the barn, for example. That, I have to admit, was a bit of a surprise to me, that it worked. I remember coming onto set, or maybe, I can't remember, Sarah, did you send me a picture or something? And I went, oh thank God. Because all the colors together worked and expressed what we hoped they would express.
Well, since you brought up the barn, I want to ask Peter about the design of the barn set. It's such a, like, this was my second time seeing the movie, and I feel like this time I really was able to appreciate what you were doing and how your set sort of facilitated what Luc was doing with the camera and what you were doing. You know, you talked about having that epic feel, and you get that from that sort of super widescreen aspect ratio you're doing. Talk a little bit about designing the barn and how you sort of both were using it to tell a story, but also factoring in the kinds of camera moves and things that you knew Sarah and Luc wanted to implement.
We had started looking at some early barn drawings that I'd done, like in a rough SketchUp model, and so we had started already kind of determining some of the elements that we wanted in the barn, and then we were scouting at the same time. So we were trying to find something that at least had some of the characteristics and some of the features that we needed. We ended up with a barn that was a really great shape and size on location, but we actually had to make some significant modifications to put the doors and windows where we needed them. And I remember early on when we were looking at the SketchUp models, like I was thinking of, I'd worked with Luc before and thinking, like what DPs need. We had talked about maybe putting more windows in there, and Sarah made a really good point. She said, they shouldn't just happen to end up in a barn that is just perfect for filming. It should still feel like a regular barn. So, we, the biggest consideration that, we had to deal with is removing the posts, because most barns have a lot of posts because of the way they're constructed. So I came up with a different kind of truss system that ran the length of it, and we had 2 posts right at the edge of the hayloft, so that enabled Luc to move his camera around and Sarah to block the scenes, wherever was most convenient, and there were no impediments to either of them.
And where were you shooting the exteriors?
We found a great farm just a little bit northeast of Toronto, about an hour or so away, and the farmer was super cooperative. He changed the crops that he was going to plant because corn would have, grown too much in the span of time that we were filming there. So we planted soy, which is also a cash crop that that the Mennonite in South America grow quite often, and he let us put a system of roads, dirt roads that you see in the film weren't there, and we built, the houses on areas. We went out and basically kind of surveyed the property beforehand and said we're going to, have one house here and another house down the road there. So he didn't plant anything there, and he left hay where we needed it for like some of the scenes of the kids running around. And so it was just a perfect location to be in.
I just wanted to also mention about the SketchUp drawings that Peter had designed. Sarah always tends to shot list and hand me a shot list after the script is written to kind of get a sense of ideas. And Peter's SketchUp drawing I was using daily to literally set up virtual shots to see if the set was big enough. And that became such a valuable tool, even to the point where I got a bit ambitious and started using these lighting plugins in the barn. So we were actually able to virtually light the barn and map some of the textures of the wood, everything, so that we could look at every shot we had designed to make sure, and you could even dial the lens into the virtual camera. So not to underplay the SketchUp, it became a vital tool. So I just wanted to add that. And also we were able to put the SketchUp set on an actual Google Earth map in the right orientation, because we were actually modeling, and I was able to track the sun exactly where it would come in. So it was an amazing use of technology to not just set up the design, but to also assist in the filmmaking process. So I just wanted to add that.
Thank you. Yeah, well, that was one of the most impressive things about photography to me watching the movie again, is the way you emulate the natural light in the barn, and the way that you sort of are telling the story through the light. You're always acclimated to where you're at the time of the day, and so it's that explains how you did that.
Actually, there were two barns, because there was the barn on location, and then we built a barn in the studio for all the interiors. And because the barn that was at the location was a great size and all that, but the hayloft wasn't the right height, wasn't the right size, so yeah, we ended up with two barns.
Now, Christopher, from an editing standpoint, it seems to me like one of the challenges you would have here is a lot of these scenes, you've got numerous characters. I mean, the scenes could be told from any number of point of view. I mean, there's so many different options for different people you can cut away to for reaction shots, things like that. What are some of the factors that guide you in a scene in terms of figuring out whose point of view you're going to favor at any given moment?
Yeah, I mean, you're exactly right. There was a lot of coverage, and those performers are extraordinary. So basically, every moment of every shot was in play. There was no sort of gimmies where you could go, well, that's not good enough. Everything was good enough. Everything was great. And everything was just a little bit different. And so the process of sort of distilling the script and distilling those performances gradually went from a more sort of carrying everybody a lot. Like, let's make sure we know what that person is feeling at this moment, and jumping around the loft a lot more. And then over the process of the edit, we actually edited a lot less. It was actually a matter of pinpointing exactly each moment with each actor as they went through the emotional and intellectual process of choosing whether to stay or leave. So ultimately, it was sort of counterintuitive that you would think in order to tell the story of the full barn, you needed to keep all the women in play at the same time. But for the most part, actually, it became much more specific. And somehow that, when you were more specific of who you were staying on and cutting to, it somehow articulated more clearly what the rest of the loft was feeling. Which, that's not something you can come to right away. So there's a lot of, distilling is the word I like to use. Because, essentially you have to track very specific emotional journey, but also a cyclical journey. Like Sarah was really integral that it not just be sort of we said that, now it's done. We had to keep coming back in new ways to what they were feeling as sort of the emotion of the argument landed for them. And that also was part of the counterintuitive way of what we were working, which is generally with something you want to keep moving, you don't repeat, but this was a film that it's essential that it's responding to the tension and the fear and the need to flee immediately, and also the need to leave on their own terms. And they are slightly counterproductive, like they fight against each other generally, like just go. So finding that balance where they're feeding each other, not fighting each other, was again also a very detailed and a lot of experimenting process to find that right rhythm, and what of the script can we lose? Like, do we need those 4 lines when we have that look? So yeah, it was an extraordinary challenge and thrilling, quite frankly, to edit.
Well, and in terms of figuring out whether or not those rhythms are working for an audience and you're getting the information across the way you want without overstating it or understating it, how do you and Sarah keep your objectivity in the edit when you're looking at this stuff, presumably, day in, day out? Do you have people you trust who you watch it with or show it to for reactions, or is it just kind of intuitive?
Yeah, I mean, it's a long enough film that you're constantly circling back. So there's enough time in between versions of any particular scene before you see it again. We screened with friends, certainly smaller focus groups that would watch a link, and then Sarah and I would talk to them over Zoom, and you get a lot of insight that way. Like, we screened it, one of the early people who saw it was another editor, Mike Munn, and the Daydream Believer sequence was actually California Dreaming, which was what Miriam had written in the book. And our sense of what that sequence needed to be was, we'll do what Miriam did, or we'll choose a different song that is very specific to 2010, and we'll tell that story. And Mike was like, I'm not too sure about California Dreaming. Seems a little on the nose. So Sarah and I were like, all right, well, let's just, thank we hadn't considered that, because we were considering the 2 specific things the music needed to do. So we just thought, look, there's like 1 trillion songs in the world. We'll just have lunch, and every day we'll run a different song up against it. And, but of course, hilariously, I thought, I wonder what Daydream Believer would be like. And that was it. Like, we ran it up, and that was we never tried another song. So, but that came from feedback from friends that you can trust.
The other thing that kept it kind of fresh for us was there was a moment where it just wasn't working. There's nothing like keeping a film fresh in your mind when you realize it really doesn't work. So I think at around 3 months into editing, there was just this moment where we said we actually have to reimagine this film. We know the performances are there. We know there's like enough of amazing moments between these actors to create something, but it isn't in its current iteration working. And so there was, Dee Dee Gardner was amazing as a producer, and, we were obviously showing her cuts a lot, Frances McDormand, so we had amazing input. And there was a moment where, in terms of just trying to shatter our preconceived notions about what the film is, it kind of came up. Dee Dee sort of said, what about changing the narrator? Because the narrator had been August. In the book, August narrates the story from the minutes of the meeting, and that's how we shot it. And there was a moment where Dee Dee said, I wonder if we should change the narrator. And then, in talking to Chris, it was like, I think what Dee Dee had said, what if it's Ona telling this story to her unborn child? And then Chris said, what if it's the youngest person in the room? Because Kate was someone who had just drawn my attention over and over and over again. And then I kind of went, well, what if it's Oche talking to the unborn baby? And so it was one of those moments that happens so often in film that I don't think we talk about enough, where there's this chorus of voices swirling around each other, and ideas arrived at that could not come from one person but came from a community. And in a way that was really emblematic for me of the process of making this film. It felt like a community swirling together to get to the place that we couldn't get on our own. So that, for us, then what felt like we were kind of terrified and excited and building the plane while we were flying it, and having to rewrite this whole narration so far into the edit process and kind of remake the film according to that. And I didn't write that narration specifically with things in mind. I wrote stream of consciousness for days and days and days, and we kind of slowly pieced together how that impacted and changed the arc of the film. It made it more efficient, it got it more down to its essence, and we were hearing the voice of someone where there was this immediacy to the experience that had been a bit detached when it was August of the narrative, which worked beautifully in the book, by the way. It's just that, with the intimacy of sound and the immediacy of the image, it was really, there was an obstruction there. So that was an amazing thing in terms of working with Chris and just seeing the unbelievable agility, the sort of nimble nature of being able to kind of recreate a film, and in doing so, bring it back to the essence of the film we always wanted to make.
Well, I guess my last question is, that idea you brought up about how so many things happen in movies that aren't from one person. It's this kind of perfect storm of ideas coming together and everything. And this movie, obviously one of the great things in it is the performances. Everybody in it's great. But, I feel like acting in a movie, the cinematography is part of the acting. The costumes are obviously part of the acting. The production side, the editing. All of you, in a way, have to create an environment or create the circumstances under which these actors can do their best work. So I'm curious how each of you sees your roles in terms of facilitating the performances.
I have so much to say about it. This was the most amazingly collaborative, inclusive, wonderful, supportive production and personal experience maybe that I've ever had the pleasure to have. From the very beginning, Sarah, of course, set the tone for all of us, but we had support from our producers that I've never experienced before. We had a bonding amongst those of us working. We shared our research. It was amazing. It was so wonderful to be in a professional situation, and I'm speaking personally, but I imagine my colleagues feel the same, where my work was so respected, and where my opinion was respected, where my research was referred to. It was a professional experience like no other I've had. And we said, okay, we'll never have a show like this, because so many serendipitous things kept happening on this production, whether it was finding the right people, finding the right thing, finding the right location. But then we stopped saying that, and we said we're only having experiences like this from now. Like, the bar has been set incredibly high now. And it was a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful experience. Even if, I jokingly say this, but even if I'd never seen the movie, I had a fantastic summer. A year, really.
I guess what I would say is, like, as an editor, your job, increasingly I've learned over time, is just to listen. At the beginning of your career, you think you have to sort of control and like, I'm going to shape all this stuff. I'm going to tell, I'm going to take over the performances. And really, as I get older, it's just get out of the way and listen. And the best example I think I have of that ever is Rooney's performance in this film, that Sarah and I felt that, like, this is the heart of the film. And yet we would get a lot of notes where we feel, oh, she's a bit too beatific, we're not sure. And then we look at the performances again and we go, no, this is the heart of the film. So rather than change the performance, I felt like we changed the movie to accommodate what Rooney was doing. So we were very specific in terms of, okay, if people think this is beatific as opposed to this incredible strength, and anytime it gets tough, Owen is the character that steps in. Owen is the character that pushes things forward. We wanted to make sure it seemed a little more eccentric at the beginning, so there was a moment where we took a line from much later in the scene that felt like a bit of a non sequitur, the idea of forgiveness, and there, so that they could react as, oh, who's this crazy Ona? But if it had come in the spot in the script where it was supposed to be, it was more of a natural leap from what they were just talking about. So really, throughout the process, you're just listening to these actors. You're just trying to get out of the way, not cutting, letting them have their moments. And Sarah's taste in performance and her ability to get those performances, I think, is extremely rare and a kind of beautiful thing. It's a beautiful kind of trust she has with these actors, and they respond in kind.
Peter, do you want to talk, because you had this unusual thing where you actually met each actor to talk about each of their homes.
Yeah, and there's a lot of restrictions and rules, obviously, in how they live. So we had this great research that we had done. We'd all, done individually and then, shared it. And so one of the interesting challenges was to, create these sets for the different characters that, still fit within the rigidity of the rules of how they live in terms of, like the colors that they use and the fact that there's no decoration, and still give each character like a unique set that is right for like the home life that they live, and the challenges in their lives. And in some respects, kind of picking up on what Chris was saying, we were sometimes having to resist the natural instincts that you develop, and I was constantly telling the set decorator, no, we can't, go overboard. These are people that live very plainly. They're, like simplicity is a virtue. But even within that, there's certain kind of, I guess, natural tendencies, like they don't have any decorations on walls. Everything has to have a function. So in some of the reference photos that we were looking at, they actually might have had 3 calendars on the same wall because, like it's a calendar, but it's also an image. It's also some wall decoration, and even with the curtains and the little kind of curtains above the door. So we try to incorporate as many of those elements that is true to their life to create environments that work for the characters and still, were visually interesting and, like able to work as in the film.
It's an interesting thing, because I've had this experience on most of my films where actors walk on the set of their home and are like, what the fuck, this is how I live? Like, there's just like this moment of panic, and they're like taking set deck stuff away at the last second, and people in the art department are crying, and it's like always just chaos. And so I finally figured out in this film is you have the production designer meet with each actor early, and they talk about the character, and you have to make sure, I think, if you do that, you can trust the actor to not be stomping on the production side. So it's like, it's like if you have the right combination of people, I think those initial connections you made with like Claire and Jessie and Fran in terms of like talking about it, where I felt like, you were kind of open to their input, but they were also very respectful of your boundaries.
Yeah. And, like they had some great suggestions too. I mean, Jessie in particular, like there was some, she had thought that, her place should feel like it's her kids are in peril. So, we incorporated that into some of the things that we put there. And she wanted like a pile of rocks by the door, as if like this might be her only defense against Klaus, her husband. So there was a lot of great feedback from the actors in that regard.
Great. Well, this has been great. I've really enjoyed talking with all of you, and I want to thank you for coming, and thank all of you for coming.
Thank you so much.